Esta es Radio Havana, Cuba.
Transmitiendo desde Cuba, territorio libre en América.
A continuación, Radio Havana Cuba comienza su programación en idioma inglés por onda corta, frecuencia modulada e Internet.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Radio Havana Cuba's English language broadcast for this Sunday, January the 1st. And a very happy New Year. Feliz Año Nuevo from all of us here at Radio Havana Cuba to all of you, our listeners out there in the world. I'm Ed Newman, your host. We'll have some special year-end programming for you, so don't touch that dial. On a day like today in the year 1959, the Cuban Revolution triumphed over the bloody dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. The July 26th movement, fighting in the Sierra Maestra Mountains and in the cities in urban resistance, took control of Havana, the capital, and other major cities. Batista and his cohorts fled to the Dominican Republic in the early morning hours, taking with them as much of the national treasury as they could pack in their suitcases. The triumph of the Cuban Revolution on this date in 1959, 58 years ago today. And in 1961, on this date, the National Literacy Campaign began, a massive effort to break the chains of illiteracy. Tens of thousands of young teachers, many just out of high school, or some still even in school, volunteered to go into the countryside and in the mountainous areas to teach people how to read and write. By the end of 11 months, the illiteracy rate was reduced from nearly 20% to a negligible 3%. The National Literacy Campaign launched on this date in 1961, 56 years ago today. Now let's get things going with our first of the year programming for today, our first program here on Radio Havana Cuba in English. It's Radio Havana Cuba presenting a special year-end report on the U.S. blockade against Cuba with Lena Valverde.
Cuba recorded a new resounding victory this year at the United Nations General Assembly when the vast majority of the international community represented there voted on October 26 in favor of a resolution urging the U.S. government to repeal its nearly 6 decades-old blockade policy against the Caribbean state. A total of 191 out of the 193-member General Assembly voted in favor of the UN resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Financial, and Commercial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Also, in a switch in the 25 consecutive times that a similar annual resolution has been approved at the UN General Assembly, this time the U.S. delegation changed its previously invariable no vote to an abstention, which analysts described as a major policy reversal. Addressing the General Assembly, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodríguez thanked the United States for its abstention vote.
Ha tomado 24 años la rectificación del voto en solitario de los Estados Unidos de América en esta sala.
It has taken the United States 24 years to rectify its vote at this international forum. It's been 24 years of self-imposed isolation and failure for the United States. 58 years of heroic resistance by the Cuban people are behind today's victory. I'm thinking of my people, also of Fidel and Raúl, and particularly of the younger generations of Cubans who were born under the blockade policy and have continued this long, glorious struggle for justice. No one should underestimate the powerful political and ethical message that this UN vote sends to the peoples of the world. The truth ultimately prevails.
In his speech at the UN, the Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez pointed out that while Washington's abstention vote on the resolution was a positive step in the ongoing process towards the normalization of U.S.-Cuba relations, the blockade remains in full effect and should be definitively lifted.
El bloqueo es injusto, inhumano, inmoral e ilegal.
The blockade is unfair, inhumane, immoral, and illegal, and it must be unilaterally and unconditionally brought to an end.
The top Cuban diplomat noted that President Barack Obama has wide executive powers to do a lot more in terms of modifying the application of the blockade, and added that the arbitrary U.S. policy still is the main obstacle to Cuba's development, and its lifting remains a key factor to advance towards fully normalized U.S.-Cuba relations. Washington imposed its policy of blockade against Cuba in October of 1960. It strengthened it in 1992 with the Torricelli Law, which prohibited foreign-based subsidiaries of U.S. companies from trading with Cuba, travel to Cuba by U.S. citizens, and family remittances to the Caribbean state. Later, again in 1996, Washington further tightened its blockade policy by passing the Helms-Burton Act. In its Title III, the superpower claimed for itself the right to penalize nationals and companies from third countries doing business with Cuba involving property nationalized by Cuba after the revolution that could have some U.S. connection. No sector of Cuban society escapes the impact of the U.S. blockade. It negatively affects family economy, wages, services, product prices, and consumption levels. Tangible effects are easily found also in health, education, and the food sectors, as well as in exports and the financial sector, among others. The blockade policy remains practically unchanged despite the re-establishment 2 years ago of U.S.-Cuba diplomatic relations, and despite U.S. President Barack Obama himself describing it as a failed and obsolete policy that hampers U.S. ties with the rest of the hemisphere. In October, the U.S. government made 2 announcements regarding its policy toward Cuba. The first was a presidential policy directive which expanded and promoted authorized engagement with Cuba, but again based on Washington's imperialist and hegemonic approach. The other announcement was a 5th package of measures to modify aspects in the application of the U.S. blockade. Analysts and critics agree that it represents little movement, since it deals only with bilateral cooperation in areas such as health and the pharmaceutical industry, where Cuba registers internationally recognized advances, and changes to the maritime transportation regulations, allowing now ships that dock at Cuban ports to enter U.S. harbors without having to wait for 180 days before doing so. This new package of measures omits to address important matters for Cuba, such as allowing the island to use U.S. dollars in its international transactions or authorizing U.S. investors to do business in Cuba. Prior to and following the UN vote this year on the U.S. blockade of Cuba, representatives from several nations and blocs took the floor to raise their voices in support of Cuba and against Washington's unilateral coercive policy. Speaking on behalf of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, The representative of the Dominican Republic saluted the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba, in which context, he said, the U.S. blockade against the Caribbean state is totally anachronistic. He then urged the U.S. government and particularly the U.S. Congress to listen to the voices of the vast majority of the international community and end that policy. The representative of Mexico noted that despite the U.S. blockade, Cuba will be among the few countries in the world that will have fulfilled the UN General Assembly's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which he said attests to the political will of the Cuban government to work hard towards improving the well-being of its people, even under difficult domestic and international circumstances, further aggravated by the U.S. arbitrary blockade policy. Other nations and groupings raising their voices at the UN General Assembly in support of the Cuban-sponsored UN resolution against the U.S. blockade included China, Vietnam, Bolivia, India, Tonga, South Africa, Brazil, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Egypt, Kuwait on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Venezuela in its capacity as president of the Non-Aligned Movement, and Singapore on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In the name of the Group of 77 plus China, the representative from Thailand addressed the forum. He said that while the group welcomed the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Washington and Havana and steps taken toward normalizing bilateral ties, the measures adopted by the U.S. government are still inadequate to effectively end the negative impact of the blockade, particularly on the Cuban people.
While these are positive steps, they remain inadequate to effectively end the impact of the embargo. Much more remains to be done, especially actions by the U.S. Congress with regard to legislative bills proposing the lifting of blockade sanctions. The group also believes that the future President of the United States can and should exercise more of his executive powers to further modify blockade regulations in light of the continued disregard on part of the U.S. Congress to end these punitive measures that are essentially in violation of the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations.
The representative of Jamaica also took the floor and spoke on behalf of the Caribbean community, CARICOM.
For far too many years, the United States has maintained an embargo on Cuba through various laws, regulations, and presidential proclamations. This pernicious embargo has restricted the ability of a proud, honorable, independent, talented, and self-reliant people to conduct legitimate trade, travel, and to undertake financial transactions. The stated purpose of this all-encompassing economic, commercial, and financial blockade was to bring about political change. However, all these years later, we see that this desired outcome has failed, its sole result being the undue hardship that has been caused to the population of Cuba. We fully agree with President Obama's characterization of the embargo as an outdated burden on the Cuban people and appreciate his acknowledgement that what the United States was doing was not working. Regrettably, however, his call upon his own Congress to lift the embargo has fallen on deaf ears. CARICOM and virtually the entire international community has consistently highlighted the fact that this unilateral, coercive, and anachronistic measure is inconsistent with international law, transgresses fundamental humanitarian principles, and contravenes the United Nations Charter and the norms governing peaceful relations between states.
The presidents of various countries the world over have also condemned the U.S. blockade of Cuba. Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro said it is not merely an embargo, a bilateral U.S.-Cuba issue. It is a sustained international persecution against Cuba. Bolivian President Evo Morales said that the United States should compensate Cuba for the damage caused by the U.S. blockade. France's François Hollande has urged his U.S. counterpart to do everything in his power to end the punitive measure against the Cuban people. And Russian President Vladimir Putin said, "We will help our Cuban friends to overcome the hardships imposed by this illegal blockade." Also, during a mass rally here in Havana on November 29th at the Revolution Square to pay tribute to late Cuban Revolution leader Fidel Castro, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega said Washington's blockade policy against Cuba should be taken before the International Court of Justice to be tried as a crime against humanity. Meanwhile, Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa said,
"Evaluar el éxito o fracaso del modelo económico cubano."
Assessing the success or failure of the Cuban economic model without taking into account the over 50-year-old criminal genocidal U.S. blockade amounts to hypocrisy. Any capitalist country in Latin America would have collapsed within just a few months if submitted to similar economic sanctions.
The U.S. blockade against Cuba is still in full effect, as Washington continues to turn a deaf ear on the express will of the vast majority of the international community and its own people who are against it. Cuba has pledged to continue denouncing this failed, obsolete, and genocidal U.S. policy and to demand its immediate and unilateral lifting, and has said that it will do so without renouncing any of the principles guiding our socialist system. For Radio Havana, Cuba, I'm Lena Valverde.
Thanks, Lena. Lena Valverde with that report on the U.S. blockade against Cuba. You tune to Radio Havana, Cuba. Thanks for joining us on this, the very first day of 2017.
Compañeros obreros y campesinos, esta es la revolución socialista y democrática de los humildes, por los humildes y para los humildes.
Fidel Castro, one day before the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, calling on the Cuban people to defend their socialist revolution, a revolution of the humble, by the humble, and for the humble.
Y por esta revolución de los humildes y por los humildes y para los humildes, estamos dispuestos a dar la vida.
And you tune to Radio Havana, Cuba. Happy New Year to all of our listeners from all of us here at RHC. Stay with me now as we take a look at the top 10 international news stories over the past year, 2016. You tune to Radio Havana, Cuba. This is our annual summary of the top 10 international news stories over the past year. One of the main stories we covered in 2016, peace, finally, in Colombia. On November the 24th, the Colombian Congress endorsed a renegotiated peace agreement between the government and rebels of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. After 4 years of arduous negotiations here in Havana, both sides reached an agreement and signed an initial accord on August the 24th, but the agreement was rejected in a plebiscite held on October the 2nd. A new agreement was worked out with recommendations from the opposition, and the long-awaited process toward peace in Colombia has finally begun. The government of President Juan Manuel Santos and the FARC rebels take the first definitive steps toward peace in the year that was 2016. Another big news story over the past 12 months was the parliamentary coup against Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. An impeachment process of a little more than 8 months culminated in her dismissal on August the 31st. The move was designed to stop corruption investigations launched by the administration of Dilma Rousseff, and perhaps even more importantly, to halt and turn back the social programs established by Dilma and her predecessor, Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, and their Workers' Party. The presidency passed to Michel Temer, who served as Dilma Rousseff's vice president. a reactionary neoliberal politician who is also accused of major corruption scandals. Since taking power in the parliamentary coup in August, Temer and his right-wing cohorts have pushed through legislation that has set back the social achievements of the Workers' Party, slashing public spending and putting a 20-year freeze on funding social programs in Brazil. The Brazilian people have been in the streets over the past several months protesting these new measures and demanding new elections as a way to leave this dark page of Brazilian history behind. And you're listening to the top 10 international news stories of 2016 as covered here on Radio Havana, Cuba. Well, without any political experience, characterized by racist and sexist inflammatory statements, multi-billionaire Donald Trump shocked the world with his electoral victory in November's U.S. presidential elections. Right up to the last minute, opinion polls showed that Democratic Party challenger Hillary Clinton would take the prize and become the next occupant of the White House, but Trump pulled it out with a majority of votes in the country's electoral college, even though he lost the popular vote by over 2 million ballots. The president-elect will be sworn in on January the 20th in Washington, which promises to become the site of one of the largest demonstrations to date against Donald Trump. Throughout the world, speculation runs rampant as to exactly what course the newly elected leader of the United States will take. His statements have been blatantly reactionary, racist, anti-immigrant, and pro-business. But there remains the question as to whether or not Donald Trump will soften his stance and at least pretend to be more pragmatic, or will he carry out all of the things that he's threatened to do upon taking office? Leading up to January the 20th, the Trump transition team has announced nominations for his cabinet, including billionaires and retired Army generals. Many of his critics warn that this points to an extremely reactionary direction, with an emphasis on racism, white supremacy, and attacks on immigrants and ethnic minorities. During 2016, the Bolivarian Revolution faced serious challenges in Venezuela from the opposition, supported from the outside in attempts to overthrow the government of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. The opposition teamed up with right-wing governments in Latin America and their benefactor, the United States, to try to put an end to the threat of a good example. Venezuela, with its social programs that benefit the vast majority of the people, has been forced to spend valuable time and resources to resist the moves of the opposition. In addition, 3 countries with right-wing regimes in Mercosur, Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, teamed up in an attempt to suspend Venezuela from Mercosur. Over the past year, the head of the Organization of American States, the OAS, the former Uruguayan foreign minister, Luis Almagro, launched personal attacks against Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, and the Bolivarian Revolution. Over the past 12 months, the Venezuelan National Assembly, controlled by the opposition, turned its back on emergency economic measures put in place by President Maduro. Despite serious attacks on its economy, Venezuela maintained the main social missions. Shortages of basic products and commodities caused by speculation and fueled by right-wing forces hit Venezuela especially hard, but the government and people of Venezuela remain on course. And you've tuned to the top 10 international news stories of 2016, as covered here on Radio Havana, Cuba. The military situation in Syria reversed during the year 2016, and the Syrian army advanced in the northern city of Aleppo, taking it away from terrorist forces that had controlled the country's second most important city for 4 years. The opposition suffered their biggest setback since 2012, when the Syrian army under President Bashar al-Assad recovered cities occupied by the al-Nusra Front and other terrorist groups. Following the breakdown of a fragile truce in Syria between Russia and the United States in September, President al-Assad stepped up the offensive against the terrorists. With the support of Russia, the Syrian people continue to resist attempts of regime change orchestrated by the United States and its close military and political allies. The new year, 2017, will hopefully see a continuation in the progress to establish real peace for the Syrian people. In the United States over the past year, white police officers continued to shoot and kill innocent black youth, fueling protests across the country and building a resistance movement under the group Black Lives Matter. The immunity shared by the police who rarely face convictions or punishment for their crimes, let alone jail time, marked yet another 12 months with no end in sight. In fact, since November in the U.S. elections, many see the presidential victory of Donald Trump as a green light given to his supporters, making the open and shameless expression of racist and sexist comments in fashion. And in recent weeks, increasing numbers of attacks on people of color and or foreign immigrants, both verbal and physical, are taking place throughout the United States. And you're listening to the top 10 international news stories of 2016, covered here on Radio Havana, Cuba over the past year. Ecuador and Italy suffered major earthquakes with serious human and material losses over these past 12 months. In Ecuador, the South American country is still recovering from a huge earthquake that struck on April the 16th, which left 661 dead and thousands of victims. With its epicenter on Ecuador's northern coast, the earthquake is considered one of the most deadly of the last years in Latin America. The earthquake totally destroyed more than 800 buildings and damaged another 600. The quake caused the collapse of roads and other infrastructure, especially affecting tourist areas. Another earthquake shook the same area in December, but did not cause nearly as much damage as the one in April. And a major earthquake hit central Italy on August the 23rd, measuring 6 on the Richter scale. More than 250 people were killed, including a number of children. The quake, with its epicenter in the mountainous areas of Italy, wiped out several towns. Well, the ongoing refugee crisis in Europe continues as we enter the new year, 2017. A record 5,000 immigrants are believed to have drowned in the Mediterranean Sea over the past year, following 2 shipwrecks during the last week of December in which some 100 people, mainly West Africans, were feared dead. According to the International Organization for Migration, or the IOM, and the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, the crisis has reached unprecedented proportions. The UNHCR appealed to states to open up more legal pathways for admitting refugees, resettlement programs, private sponsorship, family reunification, and student scholarships would help so that we do not have to resort to dangerous journeys and the use of smugglers. The International Organization for Migration figures show that 358,000 migrants and refugees had entered Europe by sea during the year 2016, up to and including December the 21st, arriving mostly in Greece and Italy. And you're listening to the top 10 international news stories of Radio Havana, Cuba for the year 2016. The United Nations Children's Fund has warned that nearly 500,000 children will face starvation in the coming year in northwest Nigeria, which is gripped by a devastating humanitarian crisis created by Boko Haram terrorist group. UNICEF Executive Director Anthony Lake pointed to the increasingly dangerous situation during 2016, said that the crisis can become a catastrophe. He said that around 400,000 children in Nigeria are at risk of famine, adding that 80,000 of the children could die from hunger within the next few months as we enter the new year. The UNICEF official added that if the hunger-stricken children are not provided with proper treatment and sufficient food, 1 in 5 of them will die. Reports indicate that the current humanitarian response is insufficient in Nigeria amid extreme levels of food insecurity. And the past 12 months have seen some of the hottest temperatures on record. In fact, the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, says that 2016 is on track to be the hottest year on record, in part due to particularly high temperatures in the Arctic. And if that warning isn't enough, in what many say is a frightening prospect for the future, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's transition team has asked the State Department's Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science for information on its funding of international environmental groups. The move has sparked concern that the new administration in the United States will slash funding for climate change programs. And you've been listening to the top 10 international news stories over the past year, 2016. From all of us here in Havana to all of you wherever you are in the world, we wish you a very happy holiday season. We here at Radio Havana, Cuba remain committed to keeping you informed as we go into the new year, and we hope you continue to keep your dial set on your radio, Radio Havana, Cuba. And you've tuned to Radio Havana, Cuba. Happy New Year. Feliz Año Nuevo to all of our listeners here on RHC. Up next, we have a special message from Radio Havana, Cuba for the new year.
The new year is always an important date in the life of peoples and nations. For many, it is a date for remembrance, meditation, and happiness. And for Cubans, the 1st of January marks a new anniversary of the victory of the revolution, the 58th this year. A victory that put an end to a bloodthirsty dictatorship and opened a new era of change and achievements. Over the past 12 months, there have been many transformations in the process of improving the Cuban economy and society. We have been celebrating a group of important anniversaries, including the 55th anniversary of the victory at Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs, of the foundation of Radio Havana, Cuba, and of the proclamation of our country as a nation free from illiteracy. All these events were decisively influenced by the thoughts and actions of the historic leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro. The date of November 25th, on the 60th anniversary of the departure of the Granma yacht from the Mexican port of Tuxpan, with 82 expeditionaries aboard, commanded by Fidel Castro, will forever remain in the memory of the Cuban people and of its many friends around the world. That day marked the passing away of our unforgettable Commander-in-Chief at 90 years of age. Neither will be forgotten the 9 days of national mourning, the huge national mobilization to bid farewell to our Commander-in-Chief along the roads from Havana to his final place of rest, the presence of many leaders from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Europe who flew to Havana to pay homage to the Cuban leader, the massive ceremonies at Havana's Revolution Square and Santiago de Cuba's Antonio Maceo Square, as well as the interment of his ashes on Sunday, December 4th, at the Santa Ifigenia Cemetery in Santiago de Cuba, very close to the mausoleum keeping the remains of the apostle of Cuba's independence, José Martí, who was the main inspiration of the historic saga played by Fidel Castro. 2016 has come to an end, and despite the 25th consecutive yearly victory at the United Nations of Cuba's demand for the termination of the U.S. blockade, Washington continues the genocidal, economic, commercial, and financial blockade against our country, as well as the radio and TV war against the island, while the U.S. Congress has refrained from abolishing the so-called Cuban Adjustment Act, which fosters illegal and clandestine departures from our country and continues the illegal occupation of a portion of Cuban territory with the aggressive U.S. Guantanamo naval base established 113 years ago. But in 2016, the Cuban presence in the world strengthened considerably. Our country conducted with responsibility and spirit of unity the presidency of the Community of Caribbean States, and its role was praised by such important institutions as the World Health Organization and the United Nations Educational, Cultural, and Scientific Organization, the UNESCO. The International Collective of Radio Havana, Cuba, ends a year of fruitful work in its mission to spread around the world the reality of our people, fighting against lies and promoting the right of all on this planet to receive truthful information in a world still plagued in many areas by inequalities, selfishness, and unjust wars. With the truth as our flag, supporting those oppressed anywhere in the world, we have broadcast in 7 languages on shortwave, FM, and Internet, and through our webpage we make use of new technologies. And it is on this 58th anniversary of that January dawn that had Fidel Castro as its main figure, we begin this new year, 2017, insisting in Fidel's own voice his concept of revolution, which embodies in a brilliant synthesis his political legacy, openly and publicly proclaimed by the immense majority of the people of Cuba.
Alberto de Perez with our special year-end message from Radio Havana, Cuba. And a Happy New Year, Feliz Año Nuevo to all of our listeners here on Radio Havana. Now we join Gerwin Jones and Rita Marin. They'll have a look at the past year in the cultural world.
Hi, Gerwin Jones here with Rita Marin and a review of cultural events in Cuba for 2016, revealing a staggering outpouring of national creativity in almost all of the arts and crafts. In terms of dance and music, the spectrum is just about complete. The graphic arts and photography have an equally powerful presence in the island, and writing and publishing go at a pace. What follows is a month-by-month, city-by-city selection of events and probably represents a fraction of what actually went on, culturally speaking, in 2016.
Le he preguntado a mi sombra a ver cómo ando para reírme.
The city of Santa Clara's busy January cultural calendar, the fullest in the region, included the annual Festival de la Trova Longina that took place from the 6th to the 10th and is a dance and music festival celebrating the life of the great trovador Manuel Corona. This was followed by a 7-day theatre festival at El Menjuje during the last week of the month. In mid-January, Trinidad Culture Week, or Semana de la Cultura Trinitaria, honoured the anniversary of the city's founding some 500 years ago. And in the nation's capital, the Havana Folk Cuba dance workshops started on the 3rd Sunday of the month for 2 weeks.
In February, in the city of Camagüey, there was a full week of cultural celebrations commemorating the city's foundation. This festival took over the whole city the first week of February and continues to be seen as one of Cuba's best cultural fates. Simultaneously, in Old Havana, the Festival of Música Antigua took place. This unusual musical event featured medieval, Renaissance and Baroque music in honor of the celebrated 17th century Cuban composer Esteban Salas. From February the 10th to the 17th, the Havana International Book Fair transformed the old Spanish fortifications of San Carlos de la Cabaña overlooking the Havana harbor, one of the biggest book parties in the world. The fair is considered Cuba's premier cultural event, as well as the event with the highest attendance in the island, with over 2 million people coming from the capital alone, plus many, many more in the rest of the country. This year's edition paid homage to the Cuban poet Lina de Feria.
In Santiago de Cuba from the 6th to the 11th of March, the Memorial Santiago Alvarez International Documentary Festival took place. This event comprised a documentary competition and demonstrates Cuba's support for a filmmaking genre that depicts contemporary realities and gives a voice to independent journalists, artists and individuals to communicate what they see as interesting and important issues in the world today. Also in Santiago de Cuba, the International Pepe Sanchez Trova Festival celebrated the Trova musical genre. The festival began in 1962 in homage to local Santiago de Cuba composer José Pepe Sanchez, considered the father of Cuban Trova. The closing of the festival on Troubadour Day, March 19th, commemorated the anniversary of the birth of Pepe Sanchez. From March the 7th to the 12th in Havana, the Memorial Guillermo Barreto Festival honored the life of one of Cuba's greatest percussionists, Guillermo Barreto. During the 1950s, he was a featured artist at Havana's Tropicana Club. Percussion in Cuba is of course a revered art and taken very seriously. The festival featured performances, competitions, concerts, lectures and speeches. In Old Havana, International Electroacoustic Music Festival got underway on the 16th, organized by composer Juan Blanco, a pioneer of electroacoustic music in Cuba. And towards the end of the month, the Havana World Music Festival was held from March 24th to 27th.
And Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones performed in Havana on Friday, March the 25th, 2016. The Stones gave a free concert, becoming the most famous act to play Cuba since the 1959 revolution. A giant screen displayed the words, "Welcome to Havana," as the Rolling Stones got on stage for their concert at the Ciudad Deportiva in Havana.
The month of April saw Ritmo Cuba, the International Salsa Festival, get underway on the 24th.
May Day, International Labor Day, or Dia de los Trabajadores, the international workers' holiday on May the 1st, was, unsurprisingly, massively celebrated all over the island, with workers marching to their main squares or revolutionary monuments. There was lots of dance, music and song. In May, we also had the Cuba Disco event, the annual musical contest held by the Permanent Committee of the International Fair Cuba Disco, along with the Cuban Institute of Music. This fair is the most important event in the Cuban musical calendar, especially for the Cuban music record industry, and takes place every year in the month of May. Along with the festivities, there were a number of exhibitions, CD launches, conferences, and colloquiums that took place during the week-long festival. Many musical performances by both local and international talent were held across Havana during the event. At Cuba Disco, over 2,500 music titles and live shows took place. The event is considered to be a vital platform for new talent and a forum for budding Cuban musicians to perform and interact with some of the biggest names in the Cuban music industry. May of each year in Havana, Cuba. Independence Day was celebrated on the 20th, remembering this important day in 1902 and the ending of Spanish rule in Cuba.
In the city of Trinidad, the Festival Internacional Boleros de Oro took place in June to celebrate the renowned Cuban dance and musical genre, the bolero, world famous since its development in the 19th century. In June, Cor Havana ran from Monday 27th to the 2nd of July in Havana's Teatro Amadeo Roldan and the Basilica Menor del Convento de San Francisco de Asís. The event was presided over by one of the leading choral directors in Cuba, Digna Guerra, who today heads the National Choir.
In July, a traveling series of films from the Caribbean was screened in movie theaters in Havana and in Santiago. Initiated with great success in February of 2007 in Havana, with the aim of acquainting audiences with the cinematic production of the region, this year, the event, which was organized by UNICEF and UNESCO, was dedicated to feature-length films, documentaries, and animated films for children and adolescents, and included countries from the Caribbean continent, such as Colombia, Venezuela, and Panama. In July, Moncada Day, July the 25th, is the most significant date in the revolutionary calendar, commemorating Fidel Castro's unsuccessful attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, widely regarded as the beginning of the revolution.
In September, in the city of Matanzas, the Festival of Origins celebrated the island's diverse ethnic heritage. The Spanish, African, Haitian, Caribbean and Chinese influences on the indigenous culture of Cuba were discussed during seminars. For the less academically involved, there were lively gatherings with pulsating drum rhythms, costumed parades and street parties.
In the month of October, and in the city of Holguin, the Festival of Ibero-American Culture celebrated the multicultural nature of the Cuban population, its history and heritage. There were musical and dance events, handicraft shows, street parties, and lots more. Independence Day, or Dia de la Independencia, on October the 10th, honored the day in history in 1868 when Carlos Manuel de Céspedes started the War of Independence against the colonizing Spanish.
In Havana, from November 15th to 23rd, the Joe Jazz Festival of up-and-coming jazz musicians took place at various venues across the capital. And in Camagüey City, the International Annual Video Art Festival took place in November, as did the annual Amphora International Magic Festival in Las Tunas. In Manzanillo, the Carlos Puebla Folk Festival, or Festival de la Trova Carlos Puebla, took place from November 29th to December the 2nd. And in Santiago, from the 27th of November to the 3rd of December, the International Festival of Choirs was staged, attracting choirs from across Europe and the Americas, as well as local entries. This famous six-day event included both concerts and contests, and offered choral music from classical through modern to Cuba's traditional trova songs.
In December, the Havana International Festival of New Latin American Cinema from the 8th to the 18th was a resounding success, as was the Havana International Jazz Festival from the 17th to the 22nd, both events signaling high points of cultural life in both the capital and the island. In Guadalajara, the annual Llena Luna Festival took place from the 13th to the 15th. In Bejucal, the increasingly famous Charangas de Bejucal took place on the 24th of December. And in Villa Clara, on the 24th, Las Parrandas de Remedios were as riotous as usual.
And that's our cultural resume for 2016. I'm Rita Marin.
Yes, thanks for listening, and stay with us for the Arts Roundup in 2017. I'm Gerwin Jones.
A look at the past 12 months in the world of culture, Gerwin Jones and Rita Marin. Time now for our weekend edition, the first for the new year, of the Mailbag Show. Hey everybody, that's right, it's Sunday and a very happy new year to all. Happy 2017. This is the first program of the Mailbag Plus radio show on this Sunday, which just happens to be January the 1st. And we wish all of our listeners, of course, a very happy new year. Happy 2017. Happy New Year to you, Irma.
The same to you, Ed, and also to all our listeners. I hope that they will join us every Sunday from today until the last day of December in this new year. All the best, good health, prosperity, everything good for all of you.
That's right. And we do this every Sunday. We have, of course, the Mailbag Plus radio program on Sundays here, and on Wednesdays, the midweek edition of the Mailbag Show. For you to write to us, you have to have our post office box address or a street address, which is P.O. Box 6240, Havana, Cuba. That's Post Office Box 6240, Havana, Cuba. Our email address is radiohc@enet.cu. That's radiohc@enet.cu. Let us know how reception is in your area, how you pick us up, what you do with us once you have us up, and anything else you'd like to know about Radio Havana, Cuba or anything. We'll try to answer your questions on the air here for us. And we want to wish, of course, all of our listeners a Happy New Year, and we've got a lot of messages that people have sent us, wishing us a Happy New Year.
Yes,
right?
Ed, that's right. So I want to begin by mentioning our friend Jayanta and Deepa Chakrabarti, a married couple who live in New Delhi, India. They wrote to us recently and they said, I want to wish you a Happy New Year. May 2017 bring you peace, happiness, and prosperity. Also, very best wishes for the new year to all the wonderful members of Radio Havana Cuba and their dear families. Okay, thank you very much, Jayanta and Deepa Chakrabarti in New Delhi, India. From the United Kingdom, we received a brief message signed by Dave Lawson, who says he is acknowledging receipt of the pocket calendar for this year, and he also wishes everyone at Radio Havana Cuba, the Cuban people, a happy and peaceful 2017. And from Moscow in Russia also came this brief message signed by Andy Martinyuk, who wishes Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone here in Cuba. Okay, thank you very much to Andy, Dave, and Jayanta Chakrabarti for their New Year greetings.
I've got something here from India as well, season's greetings. This is from our listener. It is Machi Rahu Suba, I think it is. Sent us a little Merry Christmas, Happy New Year 2017. Kind of a scan here into a email that was sent to us. Thanks.
Yes, a nice postcard.
A nice little postcard here from India. All right, thanks for writing to us here at Radio Havana Cuba. Also from the UK, here's a card sent by snail mail, and it got to us from our listener Alan Rowe, who writes to us from Middlesex in the UK, in the United Kingdom. Alan Rowe writing to us here and sending us a postcard. It's a greetings card for Season's Greetings. Thanks, Alan. And from Canada, this is from our listener Bob Quinlan, Season's Greetings, and he sent a report. He listened to us on 6,000 kilohertz, which is the frequency we send up the antenna straight up into the United States, into Canada. He's up there in Beamsville, Ontario, Canada, way up there. Probably cold and a lot of snow probably right now in his part of the woods. Rob Quinlan writing to us from Ontario, Canada, and sending his Season's Greetings, which we send right back to you there from all of us here at Radio Havana, Cuba. And you tune to Radio Havana, Cuba. This is the Mailbag Show, the weekend edition of the Mailbag Show on Sundays. Don't forget we have the midweek edition heard on Wednesdays every week here on Radio Havana, Cuba, where we take a look at the letters, email messages, and other things that our listeners send to us by way of the mail.
Well, Ed, and here I have 3 messages, the 3 of them coming from the USA. The first one comes from Jane Hill, a friend who wrote, "Great classic shortwave broadcast is Radio Havana, Cuba. You come in clearly here in Austin, Texas, in the USA. This friend, Shane here, also expressed his condolences for the nation's recent loss." Well, thank you very much. Shane here in the USA, Shane here in Austin, Texas, for this brief monitoring report. And Kevin Duffy, who writes to us from Round Lake in Illinois, USA, he also tuned in to Radio Havana, Cuba recently on the frequency of 6,000 kilohertz. He says that reception was pretty good, and he's asking for a QSR card confirming his monitoring report. And finally, for me in this segment, here I have 3 messages from our good friend Richard Nowak in Fort Pierce, Florida, USA. In one of them, he sent a monitoring report for one of the editions of DXS Unlimited, and the other 2 messages are his entries for the 2 competitions we ran last year, that is the Philatelic Contest and also the general competition dedicated to the 55th anniversary of Radio Havana, Cuba. Okay, thank you very much. By the way, in the next few days we will be announcing the winners of this year-long competition that we ran during 2016.
That's right. Richard Nowak there in Fort Pierce in Florida just got his his entry's in right under the wire there. And someone else who got it in just in time.
As a matter of fact, he wrote to us on the 28th and 26th of December. So they got here on time. And we got something else here too from India. Just came in time. It's dated the 28th, so it came in since our last program on Wednesday, the midweek edition. It's the World of Stamps contest entry for 2016. And here it is, the philatelic stamp collecting entry into our contest. From India, it's from Miss Hajira Unaiza. Yes.
All right, our philatelic entry here into the contest for this last year, actually. Now it's been a year ago. It's just yesterday. It was the other year. Now it's a new year today. All right, well, thanks for writing to us here and for your contest entry. You got it in time. Here's something from Germany, from our old good friend, Manfred Korn, who wrote to us. He is getting in, just in time, his contest entry for the 55th anniversary of Radio Havana Cuba, our general contest. We had two running last year, the philatelic stamp collecting, and this one for the general 55th anniversary of Radio Havana Cuba. And as you mentioned, Irma will be probably in just the next few days.
Yes.
We'll be announcing the winner.
Yes.
Of the winners, plural, of these contests.
I already saw some of the gifts or souvenirs that will be awarded to the winners, and they are really lovely.
Oh, great.
I should have sent my entry as well to that competition.
Yeah, that would have been good. We don't want to do that, though.
No, of course not.
Of course, we want to leave it off for our listeners. And I've got something here, too, from Malaysia. This is from Peter N. NG. I don't know how you would say that, but Peter, you know who you are, writing to us. Greetings from Malaysia. This is to inform you I heard your station, Radio Havana Cuba, on 15,230 kilohertz in Spanish. All right. Good reception there, all the way in Malaysia, over there in Asia. Thanks for writing to us, Peter, and keep in touch with us here at Radio Havana Cuba.
Well, a friend named Ty Nace Wonder wrote to us from Ohio in the USA. He says that he was able to receive an excellent signal of Radio Havana Cuba's transmissions in English. In fact, among the programs he heard was the Mailbag and the World Stamps show. That was back in December the 23rd. Okay, thank you very much, Ty Nace Wonder in Billsville, Ohio, USA. And from Japan, a friend, Akinori Manigua, also wrote to us by snail mail. He sent his condolences for the death of former Cuban President Fidel Castro Ruz, who passed away on November the 25th. He says that after the news was revealed, he sent a letter to the Cuban embassy in Tokyo expressing his feelings about Fidel's death. Okay, thank you very much for writing to us and for this information that you have provided to us. That is Akinori Manigua in Japan. And finally, for me and maybe for the program, our friend Jim Dennis in the USA is very happy, by the way, to have his pocket calendar with the portrait of Fidel at hand. Okay, thank you, Jim, for writing to us, and stay tuned to Radio Havana Cuba.
That's right. Well, that's about all the time we have for this first edition in the new year, 2017, of the Mailbag Plus radio program. Write to us if you'd like to be on future programs throughout the year. P.O. Box 6240, Havana, Cuba. That's Post Office Box 6240, Havana, Cuba. Our email address is radiohc@enet.cu. And Irma, will see you next week, next Sunday.
Yes, next Sunday I will be back here.
All right, right here on Radio Havana, Cuba. And you're tuned to Radio Havana, Cuba. That's about all the time we have for today. But you can come back and listen to us tomorrow here on Radio Havana, Cuba. From Studio 8, this has been our English language broadcast for today. On the controls, Jose Pepe Costa Pupo. Artistic direction, Annabelle Fontanella. And general production by Juan Jacomino. I've been your host, Ed Newman. Tomorrow in our programming, we'll have our Monday lineup, along with a special report on the big march and parade that will take place tomorrow, Monday, at Plaza de la Revolucion here in Havana. And we'll have more special holiday programming right here on the radio, Radio Havana, Cuba. mañana.
Esta es Radio Havana, Cuba.
Transmitiendo desde Cuba, territorio libre en América.
A continuación, Radio Havana Cuba comienza su programación en idioma francés por onda corta, frecuencia modulada e Internet.